Hi, this is Wayne Bergeron, and you're listening to The Other Side of the Bell.
Hello, and welcome to The Other Side of the Bell, a podcast dedicated to everything trumpet, brought to you by Bob Reeves Brass. We'll help you take your trumpet playing to the next level. I'm John Snell, trumpet specialist at Bob Reeves Brass, and I'll be your host for today. My special guest today is trumpeter Marc Caparone. We'll get to Marc's interview here in a moment after a word from our sponsor and some trumpet news. Today's episode is brought to you by Bob Reeves Brass, who share your passion for creating extraordinary music. You know that feeling when your instrument just clicks and the music flows effortlessly? That's what Bob Reeves Brass has been helping customers do since 1968. We've helped brass musicians like you achieve their dreams by ensuring their equipment is always in perfect harmony. We know you want to immerse yourself in the art of music making, and we're here to remove any barriers between you and your creative vision. At Bob Reeves Brass, we work closely with you to understand your unique needs and provide tailored solutions like valve alignments, custom-fit mouthpieces from our extensive stock models or a hand-carved custom mouthpiece, gap adjustments with the Reeves sleeve system, or even tweaking your existing gear. No matter your level of experience, we offer free consultations and serve musicians from all walks of life. And if you're looking for the perfect instrument to inspire your next musical masterpiece, we proudly carry the exquisite Van Laar line of trumpets and flugelhorns, as well as the superb Charlie Davis line of trumpets. What's more, Bob Reeves Brass is taking their commitment to your musical journey even further. We're now offering a carefully curated collection of top-notch products designed specifically for brass musicians. You'll find premium guard bags to protect your beloved instruments, a diverse range of mutes from renowned brands like Ulvain mutes, Yupon and Okura mutes from Japan, Trumcore mutes, Rayano, Clary Wood mutes, and Charlie Davis mutes, ensuring you have the perfect mute for every performance. But that's not all. We've also got you covered when it comes to essential maintenance supplies, with a hand-picked selection of valve oils, lubricants, and more to keep your instruments in tip-top shape. Bob Reeves Brass is truly your one-stop shop for everything you need to fuel your passion and create music that touches hearts and souls. So go ahead, let us help you elevate your sound to new heights. Don't wait another moment to elevate your musical journey with Bob Reeves Brass. Connect with us at bobreeves.com, shoot us an email at info@bobreeves.com, and keep up with the latest news on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter at Bob Reeves Brass. Embrace your passion for music and let Bob Reeves Brass be your partner in creating the extraordinary. Happy New Year, everyone. I hope all of you had a wonderful holiday season and are already kicking things off in 2024 now that we're a few weeks in. Hitting the ground running. I know I am. We have a lot of things in store this year at Bob Reeves Brass, and I want to clue you in on some of them before we get to Marc's interview. First of all, I'm really excited to make this announcement. I've been keeping it under wraps for a few months. 2024 is the year Bob Reeves Brass adds Shires musical instruments to their collection of instruments that we carry. So that's right. Pretty soon, in a matter of a few weeks here, we will have our first Shires instruments in the shop. So long time coming. Here in LA, there's not anywhere else that you can try Shires trumpets and trombones. So we're very proud to carry those fine instruments. And so if you're in the market for a new instrument and you've considered Shires, hopefully pretty soon. Now, they are a commodity. So we won't unfortunately have all of the models in right away. We're going to start adding a few at a time as we can get them. But if you are interested in getting a new instrument and had considered Shires, you will be able to come into our shop, into our showroom, and try them out. And speaking of showroom, over the holiday break, we got all new flooring, all new paint in the front. half, at least the showroom portion of the shop. We're still working on the office and the shop. We'll get there. That's phase 2 and 3. But phase 1 is redecorating the front. So if you haven't visited, or it's been a while since you visited the shop, come on in and admire our new floor, our new paint, and our new display cases being installed, actually, as I speak. So a lot going on. We're so excited to partner up with the Shires folks. They're wonderful people, and they do a great job out there in Massachusetts. And it's going to be nice to have more of their horns here on the West Coast. And we are traveling. Here in 2 weeks, we are heading to San Antonio for the annual Texas Music Educators Association Conference, TMEA, held at the Convention Center in San Antonio. It's a great, great event. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. There's so many people, so many things to see. It's definitely worth your while. And if you want to come by the booth, we are booth 271 this year. And for those of you who've been by, you know we bring everything but the kitchen sink. So we'll have 300 plus trumpet mouthpieces, flugelhorn, cornet, piccolo trumpet. We'll bring all of the Reeves brass arc trombone mouthpieces for tenor trombone, small shank, large shank, bass trombone, alto, bass trumpet, you name it. We'll have the Dylan Hart signature French horn mouthpieces with us, as well as all of the other accessories and fun toys we carry. So guard bags, Ulven mutes, Yupon mutes, Charlie Davis mutes, Okura mutes, and a whole lot more. Oh, did I mention we're doing valve alignments at the booth? And we've already had some folks sign up already. And you can do so by going to bobreeves.com/TMEA. And you can sign up for a valve alignment and save some money. You can save up to $50 off the normal cost of a valve alignment, even at the shop. So not only do you save having to ship your horn out to LA, you get it done right there at our booth. You also get the alignment for less than we normally do them for. What a deal. So bobreeves.com/TMEA for all of the information, our booth number, where you'll find us, and of course, if you want to get a valve alignment. It's never too early to get our next travel date on the calendar. The National Trumpet Competition this year will be in Texas as well. And the dates for that are March 8th through 11th. And that's going to be at the Texas A&M University in Kingsville, which for those of you outside of Texas, I learned that's just outside of Corpus Christi. So if you're in and around the area, March 8th and 11th, we'll be down there again with all the trumpet stuff, the trumpet mouthpieces, the valve alignments, maybe some Shires trumpets by that point. We'll have some Van Laars there, some Charlie Davis trumpets, all the fun stuff. We'll get more details for that next month as it gets closer. And of course, we'll be doing valve alignments at NTC as well. I'm also proud to announce that this year at NTC, we've upped our support, and we are now the large trumpet ensemble division. So Bob Reeves Brass is sponsoring the large trumpet ensemble division for NTC, and we are also sponsoring the Javelina Mariachi Band that will be performing at NTC. So we're very proud to be able to support as much as we can. It's a great organization, and it's doing a lot for trumpet playing and the art of trumpet playing and getting young kids excited about trumpet playing. So we're thankful to support the organization and proud to be the large trumpet ensemble division sponsor this year. Other things going on, we have guard bags coming in. I'm picking up a selection from the NAMM show this week, so we will have a small assortment, but again, these are a commodity. So if you're in the market for a gig bag, we will have a small selection this month of about 20 bags or so coming in from the NAMM show. And we have a huge shipment coming in, hopefully sometime in February or in March. So again, keep an eye on the website. When we get a shipment in, each order, I've doubled my order and they sell out just as fast. I think we have 2 trumpet cases left from our last shipment that came in a month or 2 ago. So always check our website, bobreeves.com, and our online store, trumpetmouthpiece.com, if you're in the market for a case. All right, that's all the news I have today. Let's get right to my interview with Marc Caparone. Marc Caparone has been listening to classic jazz his entire life and is dedicated to keeping the traditions of the early jazz trumpet players alive. His specialties are the jazz trumpet styles of the 1920s and 30s, and he has also a deep interest in jazz history that started when he began collecting records as a teenager. Marc has performed and recorded with many groups around the world, including the High Sierra Jazz Band, Hal Smith's Rhythmakers with Rebecca Kilgore, Narvin Kimball's All-Stars, Sonny Leyland, Dave Stuckey's Hot House Gang, Dave Stuckey's Hoot Owls, Clint Baker's New Orleans Jazz Band, the Reynolds Brothers, the Western Swing All-Stars, and Barbara Dane, and with his bands led by his wife, vocalist Dawn Lambeth. For several years, Marc performed at Disney's California Adventure as a member of the Ellis Island Boys. In addition to leading his own groups, he has also put together groups to back up other artists. Marc is a regular member of the Holland-Coots Quintet and Sonny Leyland's Boogie Woogie Boys, and leads the Sierra Stompers and the Back O-Town All-Stars. In 2022, he was inducted into the Western Swing Society Hall of Fame. And now here's my interview with Marc Caparone. All right, joining me today, virtually speaking, Marc Caparone. Marc, it's great to have you.
Yeah, it's been a long time we've been talking about this, so it's great to have the opportunity to do it. And
yeah, I mean, we've been a long-time customer and friend, and we've been talking about doing a podcast, I think, since episode 4 or 5, and now we're finally doing it. So I'm so excited.
Yeah, God, I was just thinking about that. I think I bought my first Bob Reeves mouthpiece back in about 1992 or something like that. So it's it's been a long time, and I would have never. It was before podcasts back then. I would have never thought that I would be on
Here we
Bob
are.
Reeves podcast. Yeah,
and doing virtually too, which
yes.
we'll have to do one. We'll have to do one in person. We're actually building the studio right now.
That's great.
When
awesome.
Everything's done, we'll do another one in person. But let's get to your life, your career. You started at a very young age. Is that right? Playing cornet.
Well, actually, I think if you look at like the history of music with me, it kind of almost goes back to my grandfather, because he wasn't a musician. He didn't play an instrument, but he was a jazz fan in the 1920s. He went to college he went to Penn State University back in 1925 through 1929, and he heard, and that was one of the stops if you were in a touring band back then on the road. All the great jazz bands from that era came through Penn State, and so he got to see Bix Beiderbecke in person. He saw Fletcher Henderson. He saw just about everybody of all the great 20s musicians. So he became a jazz fan. He didn't play an instrument, but he loved music from that time, which we call traditional jazz now, but what was, I guess you would call mainstream for him back then. But he was into that music, and he. Yeah, it was. Yeah. And the brand new word. And so he was able to, he was really into record collecting. He had a lot of recordings of the music. And so he decided that he wanted his children to become musicians. So my dad became a trombone player, and he got right into what they called the great traditional jazz revival in LA in the 1950s. And it's hard to believe now, but they would have traditional jazz concerts at the Shrine Auditorium, and it would be packed, and people would be near rioting, like a rock concert. But back then, I'm talking about the mid 1950s. And so my dad had what we would call a youth band when he was in high school. He actually formed a Lou Waters style band with some of his friends, and they got to play at the Shrine Auditorium. They were on TV, and back then for Madman months, guys who sold cars and televisions. and so, as my friends now say, there was kind of no hope for me. Like, I grew up in this world of jazz, and I've been going to jazz festivals as long as I can remember. Some of my earliest memories have been going to those jazz concerts and performances. So I pretty much saw it my whole life. And so I actually, getting back to your question, I started playing when I was about 10 in fourth grade. And I know we've talked about, like, I play a lot of cornet these days, almost more than trumpet. I would say probably 80% of the playing I do is on cornet now. And my cornet history goes back to then, because we were living on a farm or in a ranch out here. It's still out here in Paso Robles, out in the country. And I joined band, and I got evaluated for band back then. I'm talking early '80s. They used to look at your teeth and say, "Well, okay, you can be a trumpet player."
Really?
And so,
oh my gosh!
I remember my band teacher. She says, "Let me see your teeth," and then she said, "Okay, you can play the trumpet." And so I was, and I'm not, even to this day, I'm not sure why I picked the trumpet. I was really, I think it was because I had seen so many jazz bands by that point, and I just loved the charisma of the trumpet players and the guys out in front, playing and communicating with the audience. So they're almost like preachers, in that role in that kind of band. And so something grabbed me about it. And so I decided to play trumpet, and I didn't have an instrument. So I had to go into the local music store and rent an instrument. And like I said, I grew up on a ranch, and we'd go into town maybe once a week. And so by the time my mom took me to the music store, they were out of trumpets. They'd rented all of them out. And so the guy says, "Well, I have a cornet you can play." And so I said, "Okay, I guess I got to play the cornet." And so, so I came home with it, and my dad, saw it, said, "Hey, that's what Big Spiderbeck played. He played a cornet, so, and not the trumpet." So maybe that planted a seed somewhere, but, yeah, so I've been playing, since then. I just love the feel of the cornet. I love, it just feels really familiar to me. I know where everything is on it, and I like having the bell a little bit closer to my ear, and, I've been sticking with it. So, of course, it fits.
How old are you when you started?
I was 10. Yeah, so I was okay. That was pretty small.
But you had been around music, like you said. You'd been around music since you were born.
Yeah, yeah.
So picked it up around 10.
Yeah, and I was, nowadays, looking back at it, I think I was really lucky because I got to hear so much great music, and I had no idea how great it was when I was a kid. And we had back then, and in fact, it still exists now. There was a radio show on the local public radio station, KCBX, called the Club Mackenzie. And there was a guy named Guy Rathbun. He's still around. He's still doing the show. I'm talking about, I was listening to this show in the early 70s, and he's still doing it now. 1920s and 30s jazz. And every week he'd play an hour or 2 hours of that. And my dad used to listen to that, and I would be in there listening. So I just heard all these great records and kind of absorbed them as a kid. And I didn't even really know what I was doing, what was going on. But later on, I'd hear a record say, I've heard that record before. I don't remember where, but it was probably on this radio show as a kid. So, so I was very lucky to be
somewhere in your subconscious.
Yeah. I was just immersed in music, from the beginning of my life. So it's been great. And, I try to do that with my kids now. I just say, I don't care if you play an instrument or not, but, you're going to listen. We're going to have a house full of music, and you're going to hear everything, yeah, whether you like it or not in the car, actually. And of course, now they're a little bit older and they have their music, and but they can. It's amazing, one of my favorite stories about that. My wife is a singer, and she would listen to jazz in the car with the kids. And my son was about 3 years old, and she put him in his car seat, and then she went out and had to get something and come back to the car. And she came back to the car, and he was singing the bridge to Polka Dots and Moonbeams. And,
at 3.
Yeah, at 3.
Wow.
And so I thought, well, that's a good start, So, but that's
a good sign.
Yeah,
that's a good sign.
So my early, I did the usual thing. Usually I was in band, and elementary school and middle school band, and at that time, it's funny, I didn't really think about playing jazz. I didn't have an interest in it until I was about 13 or so, and I was starting high school, and it's funny, I think about it now. Like I said, I grew up on a farm, and back then this is the mid 1980s. We didn't have a lot of TV. There was one channel. And I think at one point my parents' TV actually broke and they didn't get it fixed. And there wasn't anything like nowadays with all of the digital distractions or anything. So I would get really bored, and one of the things I did was went through my dad's library of books, and I started reading his books, when I was about 13 or so, just because there was nothing else to do. And he had this book. I found this book called Jazz Men, and I didn't really know anything about it at the time. Since then, I've learned, of course, that it was one of the first jazz history books. It was written about 1938 or 39, and lots of factual errors in it. But the whole book was basically a collection of stories about the origins of jazz, and it started with Buddy Bolden and New Orleans and all the great players from that era. And it was basically told as a series of kind of romantic stories. And I read that book and something just hit me. I said, this is really interesting. And so that was what kind of got me interested in jazz, made me switch. It's funny because it was around me and I didn't really care about it, but that much as a kid, but all of a sudden I just read this book and it really clicked with me. Yeah.
Something about the stories and the music and you said it's a teenager, right? You were 13 and I wanted to ask, so were you primarily self-taught and through the band kind of thing, or did you ever have a private instructor?
I didn't, it's funny. So I live in the Central Coast of California, and now it's pretty well developed, but back then it was kind of desolate. There wasn't a lot, and I didn't have a trumpet teacher per se until I was about, I would say maybe 7th grade, something like that. And there was a local band director from another town who was a trumpet teacher, and he gave me my first trumpet lessons and pretty basic stuff, a lot of scales. And interestingly, though, he did give me some Bill Adams things to work on, or some
interesting.
And so, I was blowing on the lead pipe and doing some of that stuff. But I didn't, I wasn't really in an environment where I could take a lot of lessons. And so I would say I was pretty much self-taught. And then around this time when I started getting into jazz, I went down kind of a trumpet rabbit hole, which was, so I had basically been given, so I started with this jazz book, and I ended up through my dad was playing in a traditional jazz band at that time, and I thought, shortly after I read this book, I decided, well, I want to go to one of the rehearsals and see what's going on. And so I went to this rehearsal of the band, and the leader of the band, a guy named Jeff Beaumont, he just passed away this last year, but he was a great mentor to me. He heard, I started talking to him, and I mentioned I read this book and I was interested in King Oliver and Freddie Keppard and these characters in this book. And he said, well, here, and he handed me this big stack of LPs, and they were all early jazz recordings. And it kind of blew my mind. I was like, I can hear these guys. I can hear what they sounded like. And he said, yeah, here's a King Oliver record. Here's a Freddie Keppard record. And so I remember taking him home that night and really quietly going up to my dad's stereo and putting the records on and listening. Like, wow, this is what they really sound like. And it was kind of mind blowing for me.
How cool.
And so
the guys you read about in the book, you were able to hear.
Yeah.
And
it just was
actually,
it was like a great, I don't know, you read the story, it's like reading kind of some sort of myth, and then you actually get to see the characters in the myth, in real life. And so, it was really a profound experience for me. And so that kind of sealed the deal. I thought, well, I want to try to play like these guys. And I thought, this is so great. Somebody's got to bring this music back, which is funny. It's a theme that's gone on over and over in the jazz world. Like somebody falls in love with an older style of jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we got to bring it back, so I started getting interested in trying to play like these early New Orleans players. And it's a very different, it's so completely removed from modern trumpet playing in many ways, the sound, the embouchure, the approach, the way that you phrase, everything is so different from now. And so I started kind of going down this rabbit hole. Like, I want to learn to do this. And so I would listen to these records, and I taped them all on a cassette, and I remember I got a Walkman when they first came out, and so I would walk around with this Walkman on with King Oliver playing, and you talk about dirty, and so I just kind of absorbed all this music, and I remember I'd fall asleep with my Walkman, playing Tommy Ladner or Freddie Keppard or early Louis Armstrong, the Hot Fives and everything. And so it was it's funny. You can become a teenager and you want to do something different. And this was kind of my being different.
Became your identity. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. And I love the fact that the rebellious teenager and you snuck away to your dad's record player to listen.
Yeah.
To listen to your heroes that you read about in a book. I mean, how cool.
Yeah, it was really, yeah. I look back at it now and it was really funny. It's really, and it's funny. I have friends now who are traditional jazz players, and their kids, their way of rebelling was to go into ragtime. So every generation has their thing, I guess.
Hey,
yeah.
Man, I should be so lucky with my kids that that's how they rebel. So did you start playing in bands? You said you were sitting in rehearsals and stuff. When did you start actually, gigging or sitting in?
Well, so my dad was in this band, the Rent Party Stompers, back then is what it was called. And I mentioned this guy, Jeff Beaumont, who gave me the records initially. He was very interested in helping me. And so he said, look, if you can, if we can add you to the band and play second trumpet. And I thought, well, that's great. I'd love to do that, but I don't know how to play second trumpet and there's no parts. And he said, okay, well, we'll fix that. And he came over to my house, and my dad had a boom box that you could record things on, and on the cassette. And he came over, he said, okay, we're going to go through all the tunes in the book, and you play. He was primarily a reed player, but he could play a little bit of trumpet. And he said, we're going to go through the whole book. You play the first part, and I'm going to show you how to play a second part to it. And this is kind of an art. I mean, I think about it now, it's kind of an esoteric thing to be able, and it's something that's in the genre of music I play is kind of a necessary skill, but not a lot of people can do it even now, which is to play in a band and improvise a second trumpet part, which is, if you go back to like Louis Armstrong and King Oliver in the Creole Jazz Band, that was the kind of the pinnacle of that. Louis played the most beautiful harmony parts to second trumpet parts to King Oliver. And so we spent an afternoon, me reading a chart and playing the lead, and he improvised the second part. He said, okay, now you got it all on tape, and now you can learn it. And if you can learn it, I'll let you be in the band, And so I spent, and that was kind of early ear training for me, really. And I spent, a month or two playing along with this tape that we had made and trying to figure out second parts to these songs. And I finally got so I could do it. And he said, okay, you're in the band. And I remember we played a gig. I can't even remember where it was now, but I got $40. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, people are going to pay me to do this. And then it was kind of over. I was like, I'm going to be a jazz trumpet player. if people sold, you know,
How funny.
I was about maybe 14 or 15 at that time. And I was like, wow, I can make money doing this. And, so that was kind of where I got started.
That was a chunk of change back then.
Yeah, it was a lot more than now. And yeah, you could buy a lot of stuff with that. And, it was, so it was a turning point for me. And through that band, I started just kind of getting out there. And, it's funny because in recent years I've been starting to teach and I've thought a lot about how you learn jazz. And I realized that I kind of learned it the old fashioned way, you know, I didn't have any formal jazz training. You know, I didn't go to any kind of jazz music school or anything like that. And it's interesting because my wife did, and we'll compare notes sometimes about, you know, how she learned to play something versus how I learned to play it, and it's very different. And
but you end up at the same result.
Yeah, it's like some little differences, you know. But you know, it's interesting because I've heard, like, there's a great interview with Sonny Rollins where he talks about as a kid, when he heard jazz, he said, I want to do that. You know, I want to learn to do this. And then he had his heroes like Coleman Hawkins and then later Lester Young. And you have these figures that inspire you. And that was kind of the way that I learned to, you know, learn to play. And so a really important part of learning to play is to have that desire, kind of that drive to move forward and, you know, learn as much as you can.
Now, did you end up having any sort of formal music education or trumpet education? Was after you started playing in bands, was it just learning the styles, learning the tunes, and working on your chops?
Yeah, that was basically it. It was, so what happened with me was, basically by the time I was about 16 or so, I was out playing gigs and I was making money playing gigs with various bands. And by the time I was about 17 or 18, I was actually traveling up to the Bay Area a lot and playing with bands up there. And so I had a different type of education than someone who, as I said, who would get a jazz degree or something. And I was really lucky by the timing. I think about it now. Back then there were so many great players. And a lot of the musicians that I was working with when I was in my teens were players who had started in the late 40s, you know, and they were still playing and just really accomplished players. And they were almost all of them, I would say, were very charitable towards me. And they always wanted to go out of their way to help, you know, both with encouragement, but also kind of with tough love. You know, if I didn't play something right, they'd say, hey kid, you know, you messed that up. This is how you're supposed to play it, you know? And, so that was a really powerful, teaching tool for me, just to have these players around me all the time who would give me advice and tell me what was good and what wasn't good. So that was kind of a compass that led me down the right path. And the other thing that really helped me too was I realized something that I even nowadays I kind of I go by, which is the more tunes you can learn, the more repertoire, the more prepared you are, the more performance opportunities you have. So I realized that if I could learn enough tunes, band leaders would hire me and I could play, you know, I could get a gig and you know, when it started off, I would play like a pizza place and, you know, and play kind of just standard traditional jazz stuff. But I realized if I can up my game and learn more complicated tunes or more esoteric tunes, I can get better jobs. And so I really knuckled down when I was about maybe like 16, 17 and started learning tunes. And I just would spend every day when I got home from school just with the record player learning tunes, you know, all by ear. I didn't write anything out. And
just listening and playing.
Yeah. And and so, I just did a tune list, or I actually just found a tune list that I need to update, but from about 5 years ago. And there's about 550 tunes on it that I can play, which means I can walk into a gig and somebody can call a tune and I'll say, okay, let's play it, and, I probably added maybe 50 or 60 since then, I would say. But that's my stock and trade is I can do that. And,
it's like a plug and play musician, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's become, I didn't realize it at the time.
You just drop into the band and the tunes.
Yeah. And that really is what if I was to say, this is what I do, I would say that, if you have a traditional band, a jazz band, a swing band, early swing band, usually small group swing. I mean, I've done a little bit of work in big bands, but mostly I play with smaller groups, but you can call me and I can come in and play a gig and know all your tunes, and you don't have to worry about anything as a band leader, that's that. I didn't realize it at the time, but as I've grown older, there are less and less players who can do that. I mean, when I was a kid, I could name dozens of trumpet players who were active who could easily do that. Walk in and, I had friends who played what they called society bands. I don't even know if those exist anymore, but they were, big bands that didn't use music, primarily East Coast phenomenon. And they would play tunes one after another, nonstop, sometimes for hours. And there would be somebody who was the leader of the band who would call the next tune while you were finishing the first one, and you go right into it. And that was an incredible learning experience for players.
And as a classical musician with a classical upbringing, it makes me nervous thinking about, not having music for an entire gig, So if someone wants to, like, where do you start, like, getting tunes? Is you just go through like songs you want to learn, or is there a certain order that if someone wants to get into this sort of thing?
I always start, what you're doing when you're learning tunes like that is there's a couple of things you're doing in your brain, but you're using your ear. So you have to be able to put on a recording or something and be able to hear what the notes are, of course. And of course you got to make sure. When I started, I started learning on a record player, a 33 RPM record player, and so you had to make sure that the record was spinning at the right RPM, or else it would be out of tune. But for me, I remember as a kid just starting really early, just really, really simple stuff. I think the first tune I ever learned was Tin Roof Blues, which is a really basic blues tune, and you kind of find your way through it, and it's basically developing your ear playing, and that's what I do with students nowadays. Is I don't profess to teach trumpet technique or how to read a big band chart or anything like that. What I like to work on is ear training. Basically learning how to play tunes by ear, which is basically how jazz was taught. I mean, we didn't really have jazz education until maybe the 1960s at the earliest. And even then there wasn't much. So we had this art form that was flourishing for 60 years that kind of developed organically in our culture, and people learned by ear, and you can still do that today. And to me, it just feels like the best way to do it. But yeah, you start simple. You have to trust yourself, and you're going to sound bad when you first start, but you just try to make it better as you go along.
And these days, I mean, for better or worse, with streaming, I suppose, right? You can just get on Apple Music or Spotify, and you have libraries worth of stuff that you can listen to and play along with. Yeah.
It's so great now. I mean, when I was a kid, when I first started, it was LPs. It was kind of before CDs were popular, and I remember my dad had some LPs in his collection. I remember reading this book I was telling you about, Jazz Band, and there's a picture of Bix Beiderbecke on the cover. And my dad had some Bix Beiderbecke records, and I put those on. I'm like, wow, this is great. This is Bix, and And I'd heard those records before, but I never really listened to them, really internalized them. And that summer, my dad took me we went down to LA and took me to a record store and said, here you can see what kind of records they've got here. And I remember they had one Bix Beiderbecke record that I'd never heard before that had tunes on it I'd never heard before. And I remember, similar situation before. I took it to my grandpa's house in LA and went in his room and put on the record, like, wow, this is something I've never heard before, a Bix, and that was such a great experience. Mm-hmm. But today I can go on YouTube and find just about anything in about 25 seconds. It's unbelievable what's out there. And
yeah, the resource is amazing. It's just filtering, and not getting sidetracked when you're.
Well, that's the hardest thing.
That's a problem I have.
Yeah. It's you can listen to. There's almost too much stuff out there now, and when I first started, I would listen to I know people who learned from 78s, and they would listen to 178 over and over again, and one tune, and or maybe the flip side, there would be two tunes, and for me, it was a side of an LP. I learned tunes listening to one side of an LP, and I would kind of pick my favorites and start there and learn from them. But the thing is, one of my mentors, a guy, Jim Lee, he always said, you learn to play jazz by playing jazz. With the idea is that you start off and it's bad, but you make it better over time, and that's really it's not very much more difficult than that, and it's a skill.
Yeah. Now you brought up Bix. Correct me if I'm wrong. You had the opportunity to play Bix's horn, right? At one point.
Yeah, I played that. That's another thing I've been fascinated with is vintage instruments, as you know, because I brought a whole bunch of them into you for festival alignments over the years. But there was a couple who bought actually one of Bix's cornets, and they bought it from the family, I believe, and they had it out here on the West Coast for about 5 years. It's now in a museum in Davenport, Iowa, which is Bix's hometown. But it was floating around the Bay Area for a few years, and I remember they showed up at a festival. I have a photo. I think I put it up on Instagram of me when I was 19, and I was at a jazz festival, and they said, "Hey, would you like to play Bix's horn on this set?" Could play the whole set, So I said, "Sure, of course," And of course I was terrified because I was going to drop it, drop my mouthpiece on it or something, And it's a gold-plated Bach cornet from 1927, I think, is when he got it. 27, 28 is when he was with Paul Whiteman, and so I got to play that horn, and I've been lucky. I've been able to collect. I have a few historic instruments that belong to. I have one of Phil. I have actually several of Phil Napoleon's trumpets, and Phil was the leader of the original Memphis Five, which was one of the great 1920s jazz bands, and so I was able to get that. I love vintage horns. I mean, I just think they're so cool. And that was the other thing about going back to that jazz band book. The cover of the book had Bix holding his Convictor and Louis holding his Busher trumpet, and Bunk Johnson holding actually, I found out later it was a trumpet that he borrowed for the photo, that he didn't actually have a trumpet at the time when the photo was taken. But so that was something that grabbed me too, was just these old horns. They look different, they look really cool, and so that's been another big rabbit hole in my life.
The equipment side of things. What fun. And so I want to talk, we were talking a little bit before about, playing second and learning the skills for that. What about, working up solos and things, so you're learning a tune, you're learning from the album, the improvisational part of it. Is that something you from listening and developing the style? Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, something I haven't talked, I've kind of been skirted around it a little bit, but if something that's so important is listening. And I think that if I was to critique some jazz, modern jazz pedagogy, it would be that you need to listen more and just listen to as many things that grab you as you can. And when I was a kid, I was listening all the time. And when I got into jazz, it was just a nonstop. I had my old Walkman going around listening to jazz all day, and I'd fall asleep at night with the tape playing, and it's like learning a language, really. I think there's a lot of similarities, the phrases, everything, it's all patterns, and you can learn the patterns like if you take a language class, and then you can spend years studying a language and then go out and try to speak it in public and maybe not be able to communicate very well. And I think it's the same way but if you hang around people and you listen to them talking, you learn how to do it kind of the right way. And I think that's really so important. You have to have that sound in your head. You got to have the phrasing. One of the things I do with my students is I make them compose solos in their head, and they can whistle them or hum them. But it's the whole idea of just making the music. There's making the music, and then there's trying to fit it into the chord changes and the structure of the song. And your brain kind of already does that. But when you're speaking, you don't necessarily think about, well, I'm going to conjugate this verb this way, and I'm going to pause at this point in the sentence. I'm going, all these things that we do naturally. So you really have to have a great big foundation of listening. And that's where I like to start. Just as much as you can, have it on in the background. Your brain picks things up even when you're not paying a lot of conscious attention to it. And then it can be really intimidating to sit down. I remember at one point earlier, I had experience with my dad. He said, I'm going to teach you how to play jazz. And this is maybe when I was about 11 or 12, and I wasn't ready to do it. And of course it was my dad, so I didn't want to I don't tell me what to do, and he tried to teach me how to improvise, and I could not do it. My brain did not work, and he kind of gave up on me at that point. And which turned out to be good, because later on, when I decided I wanted to rebel, I was like, I'm going to learn to do this myself. And so I found it very intimidating at first to try to sit down and make up a solo, so there's a lot of aspects to it. You have to have it in your head. You have to have that tune that you're going to play. I mean, you're composing, you got to make that composition in your head, and then you got to figure out how to make the music part of it. What are the right fingerings? What are the right notes? What are the, what's the right tone, and there's so much. It's a never ending process. I mean, when I'm playing in a band and I'm improvising, I need to think about a lot of different things. How the band, where are we in a tune? What's the feeling? What's the mood? What are the other musicians doing? And how am I going to fit into that in a harmonious way and not clash? And so much of it is just watching and observing and copying.
And I suppose jumping in, right? Like you said, like learning a language at home versus going to another country and then trying to speak it. Jump in and start playing.
Yeah, yeah. And you have to just say, I'm going to be terrible for a while, and it's okay. Yeah, but you get better.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, I was going to say, it helps if you have somebody saying, hey, I'm going to pay you some money if you learn to do this right. I would say, I know that was a big
dangling
motivator.
the carrot in front of you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Always a good motivator.
Yeah.
So I mean, so over the course of your career, I mean, you've played with lots of different bands and
Mm-hmm.
toured all over, all over the world. Any particular highlights for you or things that particularly stood out?
Uh, well, let's see. I've been really lucky because I've always one of the conscious decisions I made once I got out of college and was kind of out in the world is that I just wanted to play the kind of music that I wanted to do with musicians that I wanted to work with. So I think about that. I've been very lucky over the years that I've been able to do that. And yeah, I've just it's kind of like an addiction, really. Like I just want to go out and play and have another experience, have another great experience, and have another great experience. And so I would say, I've loved traveling and playing music. I played in New Orleans off and on a few times. I got to play at the Jazz and Heritage Festival, which was fun. Let's see, I've been playing quite a few times in Japan. I know we've talked about this before, and it's part of the jazz club in Osaka, and I've been there
Mhm.
5 or 6 times, and I just love it there. It's just an amazing experience, and um,
If I remember correctly, not to go off tangent, but
yeah,
you told me about the German fried chicken
well,
restaurant
yeah,
there.
oh yeah, the New München, that place
On
is
my
great.
first trip was thanks to you.
Yeah, that place is great. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. A friend of mine growing up, he said, one of my mentors, a guy named Mike Fay, he told me, this music is a filter and it leads you to all sorts of really cool things in life. And that's definitely one of them. I mean, God, I still think about that fried chicken. And the beer wasn't bad
Right.
either. But let's
Not too
see.
bad either. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I've, I would say some of the high points I've had too have been just musicians I've been able to meet and talk to. And, um, kind of one of the side things that's, that's been a big, part of my life too is I've been fascinated with the story of jazz. And to me, it's like a giant mosaic, and you can learn one part of it and you put that tile in, and then you read some other story and you learn something else, and it's like a constant story that's been unfolding since jazz started, and I've just been fascinated with that. And I collect jazz books. I probably have a couple hundred of them over here, and I actually ended up getting my degree in history because I love it so much. And um so I've been able to, one of the side effects is it's of that has been it's been really meaningful for me sometimes to meet musicians, um, and know their
Mhm.
story and know their history. And they may not be super famous or superstars, but they were part of that jazz history, and you're able to um, to relate to them. And I've had a number of a number of musicians I've met over the years who I've met, and then I ask them something about their life, and they're like, "Wow, you know about that?" And it opens up a really big, it opens up kind of a personal relationship, and um, so I've been really lucky doing that. I think traveling around and meeting, um, God, I just so many over the years. And I was just thinking the other day about there was a great movie in the 1960s. It was made in the 1960s called On the Road with Duke Ellington, and
Mhm.
it's just basically a documentary about Duke traveling around. And at one point, Duke gets a an honorary award from a university, and he shows up and receives the award and says, "And now I'd like to play a composition that I have composed and to honor the university." And he sits down at the piano with his drummer and bass player and plays this big elaborate kind of concert piece. Um and a few years ago I was in Florida, and I was playing at a jazz festival there, and I went into the musicians room, and I saw John Lamb sitting there, and John was Duke's bass player on that film. and so, he was just kind of quietly sitting
Oh,
there having his dinner. And I went up and I said, I got to ask him. I said, can I ask you a question, Mr. Lamb? And he says, yeah. And I said, well, there's this movie, On the Road with Duke Ellington, and there's this scene in the movie where Duke gets an award and he's playing this composition, and you're playing with him on it. And he says, yeah, I remember that. And I said, well, did he write that out? Was it a did he actually compose that? And he said, no, we didn't have any music at all. He said, I said, so how did you play it? He said, well, I just watched his left hand. And so it was just,
wow.
it's just
Wow.
like, you look at it on the outside, you see Duke's presenting a composition, but in the reality is it's all in his head, and he's going to play it. And he has this incredibly gifted bass player with him who can just watch him and follow his every move. And, I mean, it just really, you hear about that and it's kind of a heroic thing, but you don't really, it's a story that's not out there really. And,
oh man. And that's, it kind of like just points to the bigger picture of what we do,
Yeah.
I mean, making music and all the hours in the practice rooms and listening to records and stuff. And it's, the connection with the audience, but it's also the connection with other musicians and the history behind that. I mean, it's such a rich field, that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah. There's I just thought that guy is a real hero, he was just a badass, for lack of a better term. And it was just really, it's great to know. And I mean, it also gives you some insight about how Duke worked, and how he where his music came from. And you talk about music, great music that was not written down. So much of what Duke's band played wasn't written down, or it was, but they didn't really look at it, and, I remember I just had a situation recently where I had to go in and read a bunch of charts, which is something I don't do that often. So it's funny. It's like, if you don't, it's a skill. If you don't do it a lot, you kind of lose it. And I was just really nervous about going in and playing these charts. And I remember, I think I saw it on Facebook, and there was an interview with Sam Woodyard, who was Duke's drummer, and he had a similar situation. He got called for a gig and to play with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And he's like, man, I don't read music, and I don't read music very well. He's kind of like right about my level. And, he got to the gig and there was no drum book. There was no music for the Duke Ellington band, and he had to learn it all by ear, with the other guys in the band telling him what to play. And so these things can be helpful sometimes. It made me feel a lot better.
That's awesome. I want to talk a little bit about trumpet playing or cornet playing and the chops involved. Through your career, did you have any sort of routine or anything, maintenance? Because I mean, playing the stuff you do is not easy, chop wise.
Well, yeah. It's interesting. I've been lucky throughout my career. I haven't had any chop problems, but, what I do, it's a lot of people don't understand. They see a clip of the band or something and they don't realize the context. I talked a little bit earlier about how there are less and less trumpet players now who do what I do. And so I find myself getting more and more kind of work, offered to me. And of course I like to take as much as I can, but so I quite often end up in a situation where I'm playing with two bands at a jazz festival over a weekend. And I mean, I've been lucky. I haven't had one in a while. I had one in November where I did 15 1-hour sets over 3 days. I got one coming up in March that's going to be like that. So I gotta get ready for that. The first thing that one of the great pieces of advice I got was when I took some lessons with Johan Racy, the great studio trumpet player. And the first thing he said to me was, you need to practice way beyond what the job requires. And I said, okay, if you're saying that, it's true, because he was one of the greats, and so I've taken that to heart. I try to do a pretty rigorous practice routine. Um, a lot of In recent years, when I was younger, I didn't have much trumpet instruction. So later on, in my 20s and later, even, I decided I got to get my act together, and so I started taking some lessons, and I took some lessons with Johan, which were mind blowing, just so great. I wish there was somebody who taught like him now that I could go see, because it was just incredible. It was all about tone production and sound, and I was very much one of his beginner students. But I love talking to him about the history. Gosh, uh, just kind of an aside about Yuan, I talked to him. I was very curious about his sound, because he told me that he had gotten the job at MGM because he had kind of a more modern trumpet sound than Rafael Mendez, who had been the trumpet player before. And I asked him, like, who did you like? And, he said, I like trumpet players with a really clear sound. And he said, in 1938, I went to Chicago and I heard Bunny Berrigan, and I really liked his sound.
Interesting.
And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, because you can put on a Bunny Berrigan record, like, you can put on I Can't Get Started, Bunny's famous record, and listen to it, and then go listen to Chinatown, and you can hear kind of a similarity. There's that, you can see maybe that's where that sound came, that beautiful sound that became like the soundtrack for trumpet in the second half of the 20th century. Maybe that's where that came from.
Interesting.
But anyway, yeah. So Yuan was great, but what I found, I figured that since I'm a kind of a weird corner of the trumpet world, because the sound that I'm looking for is not a mainstream trumpet sound. It's an older sound, and back then, the people's concept of trumpet tone was different. People used generally smaller equipment, smaller mouthpieces, smaller bore horns. There wasn't this big, lush kind of Bud Herseth sound that was kind of dominant, in classical music. I love listening to recordings of Harry Glantz on trumpet, who was kind of the great trumpet, one of the great first trumpet players before, of the 1920s and 30s, and very different classical sound than what you would hear now. So I decided I needed to figure out how to make that work, and make it sustainable. And so I gravitated towards the Donald Reinhardt teachings. I had been reading a lot online about Reinhardt, and it made sense to me. And so I ended up taking some lessons. I actually flew back to New Hampshire and took lessons with Dave Sheets, who was kind of the Reinhardt guy. He's still around, but he studied with Doc Reinhardt for 40 something years, and he was able to make some changes to my playing, my embouchure and everything, that really helped, and it just caused a massive increase in endurance and everything. And so most of my practicing nowadays, I do a lot of Reinhardt stuff. I do a little bit of Caruso sometimes when I feel like I need to really build up some muscles. And I've been getting, I kind of dabble in the stamp. Yeah, I don't do a lot of it because I really haven't had any formal lessons in it. I'd love to get some stamp lessons someday, but I do some, what I've been able to learn about keeping the tone, the center of the pitch and everything. And then a lot of it is repertoire. I need to work on stuff and, kind of jog my memory. And so a lot of it is which band bands, plural, I'll be playing with. And I've got to work up my repertoire on that. So I find I spend a lot of time just working on remembering everything that I need to know. And I do a lot of that by playing along with records. Put a record on 5 or 6 times and play it, and I pretty much got it by then. And but I also I've also learned how to pace my practicing in a way that's been very helpful over the years. Because I found if I over practice and I come up to a weekend where I'm playing 16 hours or something like that, it's not good. And so, I kind of have a wave pattern that I follow of intensity and then backing off and then getting intense. And then usually a few days before I go in to do something like that, I back off pretty good. And of course, throughout that, I'm gigging. And, if I have a lot of the gigs I do that are just one-offs are really strenuous. Some of the bands I'm playing with right now, they're just playing a 3-hour dance gig is a lot of work. So I try to back off on practicing on days when I'm doing a lot of doing something like that. But a lot of it is just listening to my chops, feeling, how do they feel? Do they feel like they need a rest? Or do they feel like they could take some more, some more work? So, but yeah, it's just a process. And I it's like when I'm playing jazz, I kind of go by feel. Like, how does it feel? Do I feel weak? Do I feel like I got this? Yeah. I usually spend some time doing that basic tone exercise every day that Yuan Racy has had me do. And there's some videos, I think, of him doing it where you're just playing you're finding your good note, and then you're trying to make all your other notes sound as good as that first good note and be consistent. And so that's that, and some Reinhardt things like pivot stabilizer and are kind of the basis of my warm up and everything. And
so it sounds like you're real thoughtful about your practicing, and also you listening to your body, which is something we as trumpet players sometimes we just go, and we end up injuring ourselves. We're just constant fatigue, that sort of thing.
Oh yeah. I did that one time. I wanted to do that Claude Gordon, systematic approach, and I started that thing, and it's like, I'm going to do this every day. And I got a few weeks in, and all of a sudden my lips just started hurting. And I thought, no, this is not a good idea. And I just stopped and went back to what I was doing before. And and so yeah, I don't really follow, other than working on fundamentals every day and trying to have, one of the best pieces of advice I heard, I was, listening to the Count Basie band one time with the drummer, a recording of the Basie band. And he said, the brass players aren't playing loud, but they're articulating so well that it sounds like they're playing loud. And I thought, that's interesting, And so I try to work on clean attacks. I physiologically, I have a really long tongue, so it's really hard sometimes with attacks, I have to spend a lot of time working on those to get them the way I want. But and I've been through the whole, trying to do the K tongue modified and everything, and it doesn't really work. So I end up spending a lot of time trying to get clean articulations.
But that's fascinating, though. The audience's perception of an attack. You can back off a little bit and not feel like you're, not play so loud if your attack is clean.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of learning tunes and improvising is playing in different keys. So when you work up a tune, do you also learn it?
Oh, yeah.
Do you learn it in a few other keys or all 12 keys?
I'm kind of, I basically, like, okay, so if you have a tune that you're going to learn, there's usually one or two standard keys that the tune is played in. And so I usually learn something, and I try to be practical about it and say, okay, if people play Honeysuckle Rose in F and G, I probably should know it pretty well in F and G and maybe A flat, and so that's my thought process. And a lot of it is, I'm learning a lot of repertoire. So, sometimes with a band, I'll have I had this gig I did in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago where I had to learn about 20 tunes, in a pretty short amount of time. And so you figure out, okay, what keys do I need to know these in, and learn them there and get comfortable with them. Now, of course, I'm married to a vocalist, a female vocalist, and she has her own keys for things. So I end up usually learning everything in in the standard band keys and then also her keys. So, which has been great. I mean, it's great to be able to walk in and play something in a key that's a fourth out of what's normal. But I throughout my career, I haven't had to do a lot of playing in the sharp keys, and in recent years, it's funny. I started doing more Western swing and even playing with some kind of rockabilly sort of bands, and I've been having to play more in those keys. So that's something just in recent years I've been getting more comfortable with, and by that I mean improvising, in those keys. It's something that I never had to try to do before, but now it's funny, I'll be in a band and they'll say, okay, we're playing this tune in E. And I'm like, okay, here we go.
Here we go.
And
love it. So probably the most important advice you've given so far is if you're married to a vocalist, learn the tunes and their keys.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's nothing worse.
And those are the normal keys, by the way, right? Whatever key your spouse sings this tune is the normal key, and everyone else is off. Right?
Well, I'm really lucky because my wife she's a better musician than I am. She has a degree in music and she's a piano player. So she's definitely, she knows how to make things easy for the instrumentalists when she's working with them, and I really appreciate that.
Oh, found a good one. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your current projects. You said you were just in Vegas. What are some of the bands you're playing with? What projects are you working on right now?
Oh yeah. Well, I have about maybe 4 or 5 things I'm doing right now. One of the most exciting for me is I've been Carl Sonny Leyland's band, the Boogie Boys, which has been just really great. And for those of you out there who don't know Carl, he's just a genius boogie woogie and blues piano player. He's just one of the best ever. And he had a career, the early part of his career, playing blues, primarily blues and rock and roll. And then later on in his career, he kind of focused more on playing jazz and boogie woogie, kind of classic boogie woogie and kind of the more traditional style approach. And the last couple of years, he kind of went back to playing some early rock and roll, and he put together this band, and it's me and Mondo Darame, great tenor player from he was one of the founders of Royal Crown Review, and then Carl and great Sam Roca on bass and Josh Colazzo on drums, and we do early rock and roll, kind of the early piano based rock and roll before the guitars got in there. So a lot of Little Richard and some of the great New Orleans Dave Bartholomew sort of influenced music, and that's just been so much fun. It's just been great. And in fact, I'm playing with them in a few days. I can't wait. And we just made a recording that's supposedly coming out pretty soon. And that was kind of an interesting thing because we did a full day of recording at Deke Dickerson's studio in Northridge, and Deke actually has an old recording lathe to make acetate or shellac discs. So we did a full day of recording digitally, and then at the end of the day, we did a couple sides on disc and just direct to disc. And of course, with that technology, it's 1940s technology, and you sound like you were in the 1940s. And so it was a real trip for me when they played it back. I thought, wow, that's what I would have sounded like if I lived back then,
What a cool experience. Wow.
Yeah. So hopefully, those may get on the record. I don't know. We might just release them separately, but so I've been doing that with Sonny, and that's been great. And then I play in a band called the Holland-Coots Jazz Quintet. And that's a band with a couple of guys from Nashville, Danny Coots and Brian Holland, and myself, and a great clarinet player from Chicago, and a really great bass player from Minneapolis, Steve Bacall. And we've been playing a lot of jazz festivals, and we've been doing some touring with the band, playing different concerts around. We did a bunch of them in the Midwest over last fall, and we've got a few jazz festivals coming up here in the next couple months that we're going to be doing. And And that's been really great. It's we kind of deconstruct jazz in that band, and we play a tune, and we kind of like take the tune apart and put it back together in front of you on the stage. It's really interesting. We take a lot of liberties with how to play, how we interpret a tune and play it, and it's been really fun. It's a little bit different than what I've normally done in the rest of my career. So that's been a great thing. I've been in that band about 6 years now, and let's see. And then I've got I have my own band that I started this last year called the Sierra Stompers, and that's a kind of a throwback to when I was a kid. And it's more traditional, what we call a San Francisco style jazz band. And I played in a band like that called the High Sierra Jazz Band for many years. And that band finally, everybody retired in 2019. And so I kind of wanted to keep that style of music going. And I put together a band, and it just really clicked. We had our first gig last March, and we were voted the number one band of the whole festival by the audience reviews. So it's kind of a going concern now.
Awesome.
So
awesome.
Yeah. So that's
great to keep that going. I remember seeing the High Sierras when I was growing up, and I mean, great memory. I think that was at the Sacramento Jazz Festival.
I heard them when I was a kid, and then later on I ended up playing with them 2013 through 2019 as their cornet player. So it was kind of neat to have that continuity.
Was that, correct me if I'm wrong, was that Brian Shaw that was in there?
Oh yeah. Brian, I took over from Brian. Yeah. And Brian's such a great player, just amazing. He was the guy who showed me a Bob Reeves mouthpiece and said, "You need to get one of these, kid." Back then. And, he's a great player, and he's not playing that much anymore. I really miss seeing him around. But, so I've been very lucky to kind of keep busy and do the kind of music that I want. I just finished 2 weeks in Vegas with Jennifer Keith and Mondo Durame with their band at the Fontainebleau casino that's just opened up, and they're bringing back older styles of jazz to Las Vegas, kind of the old lounge scene. So that was really fun. The place is right next to the Sahara, which is where Louis Prima and Keely Smith did had so much success, and so it was kind of cool to do some Louis Prima tunes right next to the spot where it originally happened. And
that's neat. Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm happy with everything that I'm doing.
That's a lot. Man, it's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
And have a family and keep your chops up. Oh, and by the way, run a business as well.
Oh yeah, I know.
How do you find time in the day?
Well, I've been very lucky because when I got out of college and decided I wanted to go into, I was kind of at a crossroads about music, because I knew I wanted to do music professionally, but there were a lot of things about being a full-time musician that I didn't want to do, which is a lot of it was the traveling and not being on the road and not being able to play just the kind of music I want to play. And so I was very lucky that my dad is a trombone player, and a musician, and he basically let me work kind of part-time for him for many, many years, where I was able to have kind of a day job, but also go off and play music. And over time that's worked out pretty well. And so I'm lucky now. I don't work nearly as much for my day job as I used to. So I've kind of dialing that back a lot. And so, but it's hard. I mean, as with kids, once they're in bed, you can't practice. And so a lot of practice mute playing, and that could be stressful. I've had a lot of time where I've been, on kid duty, and I got a important gig coming up and I got to get ready for it. And so, you put the practice mute in and do the best you can.
Be creative. You
Yep.
mentioned you have quite the horn collection. Is there any horns that you use regularly on your gigs? Talk a little bit about the equipment you're using.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, for me, it's always been a challenge because, I'll have these weekends where I've got to play sometimes, 15 hours, and you need to figure out how to make your equipment work for you to do that. So, over the years, I've gravitated towards smaller bore horns. Right now, well, I'm kind of torn because I just found a Con Victor that I really like, and that's of course the horn that Bick Spiderbeck played, and a lot of jazz. It's kind of, for cornets, that was one of the icons of iconic instruments. It was kind of the Stratocaster of traditional jazz, and so I've got one of those I really like, but it's a big horn, and it might be too much for me. I'm going to try it out here next weekend and see how it goes. But I play a Selmer K modified cornet right now. It's 453 bore, so it's manageable, but still sounds really nice. And I keep looking for that holy grail horn. I've have a few that are kind of close. Like I have a 1953 Bach medium bore 43 bell trumpet, which you guys did the valve alignment on, and it's the closest to a magic horn that I have. It plays really nice, but I've been finding myself going back to trying to have more of a vintage tone, vintage sound, and so I've been playing a 1948 Con 2B trumpet recently that I really like. So, but as you know, when you get into mouthpieces and trying to figure out what works, it can be a long process, and I've done a lot of work with that over the years, and had a lot of mouthpieces cut into pieces and threaded and all sorts of things like that.
We've got a lot of decapitated rims and underparts in the back with your name on them.
Oh yes, yeah. But the challenge for me is how do you have a really good endurance on a horn and have a good sound, and that's a real challenge, and so that's kind of been like a hobby of mine. How do I get so I can survive doing these long hard gigs and still sound in a way that's pleasing to the ear, and it can be a challenge, and I've just been working on it, and every time seems like every month it's a different iteration of it, and but it's an interesting challenge because it's not a lot of trumpet players have that problem, and so pretty much you have to just kind of have stuff made and try to understand how mouthpieces work and how horns work, and that's been very fascinating for me over the years. I've learned so much about mouthpieces and trumpets and where resistance should be in a trumpet, and how bells affect the sound and everything. And I just love that. I could, as you know, I could talk for a long time about that.
We'll do another episode just on equipment and the things you've gone through.
Yes.
We haven't even gotten into mutes and things too, which I'm sure.
Oh God. Yeah. That's another thing. Yeah. Yeah. I'm very lucky that I all these toys I get to use, there's a lot of mutes used in early jazz. And so the key is to find the right one, and it can get a little bit obsessive. I mean, like when I did this gig in Las Vegas, it was more of a 1950s sound that I was going for. And so I spent like a day with about 20 different Harmon mutes trying to find the one that I thought sounded the best. I was recording them and everything, and I thought, this is a little bit excessive, don't you think?
Well, I mean, you think about it. But
I did find, actually,
I was gonna say there's orchestras in Europe that use historic period instruments. It's the same thing for jazz, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I love, there's something about, putting on a record, and I know what vintage horn they were playing. Like a Henry Red Allen record, one of my heroes, and you put on a Red Allen record, and I know he was playing a King Liberty trumpet on this record, and I pull out my 1936 King Liberty trumpet and play along, and I think, God, that's what it felt like, and I don't know, you can just hear it, and it's a really unique bonding experience. And I got to go to the Louis Armstrong Archives in New York and play some of Louis's horns there, and it was it was a really emotional experience to do that. You know, it was hard to not like just burst into tears, because you pick up his horn and you see where his hands wore the gold plating off of the horn, and like, oh my God, all the music that this instrument has made, you know. And it's I just love that, you know, these artifacts.
Yeah, it's chilling.
Yeah.
Whew. Oh, what fun. What fun. Quick question before we wrap up here.
Sure.
So if for our listeners, if they want to jump into traditional jazz, just listening, is there,
Yes,
like a kind of blue kind of album for jazz, that people can jump in, or a few, 2 or 3 albums that you would suggest people kind of start their listening?
well, you can't go wrong with Louis Armstrong, and I would say the easiest is the Louis Armstrong Hot 5. The one thing that you keep in mind about that, and if you get into old records in general, is that the earliest Hot 5 records were acoustically recorded, which means, there was no electronic microphone, so the fidelity is very different than a record nowadays. So when you put on that Louis Armstrong Hot 5 CD, and you hear My Heart, which was the first tune that they recorded, and it sounds unusual. So you may not want to start with the first CD, the first recordings, and may want to wait a little bit until they started recording electrically, and then it's more, your ear will relate to it a little bit better, and that's something that that I had to go through when I was getting into records as a teenager, was listening to acoustically recorded albums, and they're very different, and you have to develop kind of ear chops to listen to those effectively. But yeah, I would say, you can't go wrong with the classics that have influenced so many people. The Louis Armstrong Hot 5, all the Bix Beiderbecke records, Bix and his gang, his small band that Bix ran himself. Those are just some of the most amazing records. And you want to try to keep an open mind too, and find your niche, because there was so much, jazz changed so much in the first, say, between, let's say, 1920 and 1940. And you may like earlier 20s stuff. You might find you like 1930s things, Bunny Berrigan. 30s Louis Armstrong is a great place to start. Anything from the 30s that Louis did, it's going to be more big band style. So I think that's a great place to start with Louis and Bix from the trumpet standpoint. If you're into reed instruments, there's the great Johnny Dodds and Jimmy Noon. Those are great clarinet players. And of course, with trombone, Kid Ory. And don't be afraid to keep listening and trying to find different things, because there are records that, you'll listen to Louis Armstrong or Bix, and then you'll hear maybe a record by the Louis Russell Band that came a few years later, and it'll blow your mind. You'll say, wow, that is the most amazing thing. So there's a lot of stuff out there, I guess is what I'm starting to say. So start with the classics, start with Louis and Bix, and go from there. King Oliver would be a great place to start, but he didn't make too many electric recordings. Most of his were acoustic. So it's really hard to hear exactly what he sounded like nowadays. But so Louis is a good place as any to start, and Bix. My two, when I started, were Bix. These were LPs that my dad had. He had a Bix LP and he had a Jabbo Smith LP. And Jabbo Smith was, of course, he was the competitor to Louis, and he was younger than Louis, and he made these amazing records when he was 21. And Dizzy Gillespie used to listen to them. He used to be inspired by them. So check out Jabbo Smith.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And if folks want to hear you, how can, or learn more about you? We talked about this. You're in the process of getting your website back up, but you're also on Instagram. Where can folks catch you?
Well, I try to put all my gigs coming up on Instagram. I try to do it at least a week before, but sometimes there's a little bit less notice. But yeah, marccaparone.com is my website, and it's I took it down because I'm working on doing more teaching now, so I'm trying to get it back up with more info on that. And that's basically there's tons of YouTube out there if you want to hear about what I do. My playing Carl Sonny Leyland. You can check out the Reynolds Brothers. That's a band I used to play with at Disney, and there's tons of YouTubes of us up there. And yeah, that's about it.
Yeah. Well, we'll have links to those, and look forward to the new website to be up when you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's always a thing. Same thing with the shop. I understand.
Well,
as an avid, go ahead.
The thing is, people don't use websites anymore. Almost, it's like you gotta be on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, and so.
Got to be everywhere.
TikTok.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. I'm sorry it took 10 years, but better late than never. And
thanks.
as an avid podcast listener yourself, you know what's coming.
Yeah.
So
the big question.
If you could leave our listeners with your best piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, I think I would say two things, and one of which is what I passed on from you on Racy, which is to practice way beyond the gig. And the other thing that I would add is, and I think this applies to any type of genre, classical music. If you're playing shows, if you're doing any kind of musical endeavor, if you can find out the stories around whatever it is you're playing, if it's the people that you get to work with or the music that you're playing. If you can find out, do some research and learn the stories about the music and the people that you're working with. And it's like that story I told about John Lamb. If you meet the right person and ask a question because you knew a little bit, it can just open up this incredible world, and it can add so much richness to what you're doing. So I would say, learn the story behind your music and the people that you're working with.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm glad you had the teeth for trumpet or cornet when you first started.
Yeah. I know.
Who'd have thought?
It worked out, yeah.
First time I've heard it. First time for everything. So absolutely great advice. And I hope you write a book someday with all the things you do, because you're such a wealth of knowledge for not just the history of trumpet and cornet, but also of jazz.
Oh, thanks.
So I hope you put some of that down and look forward to chatting with you again and hopefully seeing you in the shop soon.
Yeah. I have some work for Brett to do. So yeah, I'll be in before too long.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, John. I really appreciate it.
As we mentioned early on in the podcast, Mark is a good friend of mine and a longtime friend and customer of Bob Reeves and the shop. And literally for years, every time he comes in, I said, we need to do a podcast. We need to do a podcast. And when we do them in the shop, we could just set up in the front, but he's usually on the way to a gig or on the way back from a gig. And, one thing leads to another. And here we are 9 years later, and we're finally sitting down, virtually speaking, to do the interview. And like I said, better late than never. And as you can tell, Mark is such an amazing person, amazing player. But the context he brings, he doesn't just learn the style, he brings the story of the music, in the eras that he plays, the 20s, the 30s. And we need that, just like we have music historians, that are going back to study Mozart and Beethoven and the performance practices back then. The same is true for the jazz, our history of jazz here in the U.S. And after we hung up, virtually speaking, after we ended the interview, we had a nice conversation about how there's the next generation. Mark thought he might be the last cornetist to do what he does. And there's a lot of great young cornet players now because of social media and the internet and the access to this music that are now inspired to keep that music going and preserve it and be able to still listen to it. So anyway, this is long-winded, but a huge, huge thank you to Mark. and it was great having him on. And I know it can be nerve-wracking sometimes because he's also a huge fan of the podcast. And so then to be in the hot seat, I think he did a wonderful job, and you could really sense the passion and the joy he gets just from performing. Like he said, it's addicting. When's the next one? When's the next gig when he can, play for people and bring that joy and that energy to the crowd, but then also to his fellow musicians. There's a lot to learn there about what we do and why we do it. And that $40 that he got as a teenager doesn't hurt as well. So you can learn more about Marc. Again, we'll have the links down in the description and the show notes for this episode to his Instagram and his website. And I urge you to go hear one of his groups sometimes. He travels all over the country and all over the world. So, if you can get to a traditional jazz festival or if his band's playing locally, go check them out. It's always a great time. Thank you for listening. We have a great slate of guests this year so far. Up next is lead player and fabulous trumpet player Dave Trigg, now in New York. He was out here for a while. You know him from Maynard Ferguson, Natalie Cole, Broadway, host of great bands that he's played with. Can't wait to share that interview with Dave and some other great guests I can't quite talk about yet, but I think you'll be excited to hear from them as well. Leave us that 5-star review, hit that subscribe button if you're on YouTube, that like button. All of those things mean a lot to us to help us remain visible, or even share it. If you're on social media, say, hey, I listened to this podcast, share it on Instagram, share it on TikTok, share it on Facebook, and be sure to tag Bob Reeves Brass on there as well. And let's get this community even bigger. I appreciate you. Thank you for listening. Until next time, let's go out and make some music.